Hello, we're going to try that one again. I just realized that my microphone was muted. So hello and welcome. It's January 30th. I'm your host, Newfoundland, and we got a great one for you tonight. Tonight, we're talking about affirmative action. We're talking about student loans and business rights, all at the hands of the Supreme Court of the United States. Stick with us. We got a good one for you guys.
So, the high school drama teacher over here accuses others of liking the sounds of their own voices.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I was a high school teacher before getting into politics. I'm having a little trouble remembering what exactly the job that the leader of the opposition had before getting into politics.
Yes, and he left right in the middle of the semester, and I'm having trouble remembering why.
The small fringe minority who are holding unacceptable views do not represent the views of Canadians whose beds are filled with people who chose not to get vaccinated. The risk posed to all of us by unvaccinated people. It's never too late to do the right thing. We'll be immensely pleased to be able to give you that first dose of vaccine.
I'd like to welcome the fake news media,
and the ideology in order to push particular agendas, and I think some of those agendas, unfortunately, pretty hardcore, pretty extreme. The power of misinformation, because so much, of what we hear coming from these protesters, from a scientific perspective, just isn't true. And
can you state categorically? You are fake news,
Sir.
All right, welcome back, everybody. It is June 30th, Friday. Good evening to my fellow Canadians and anybody listening from the States. We got a good one for you tonight. Tonight, we're talking about affirmative action. We're talking about student loan, potential forgiveness, which we'll see how that turned out. And we're talking business rights, business owner rights. And we're going to start off light, and business owner rights shouldn't be a light subject, but when you're talking affirmative action and you're talking about canceling student loan debt across the board, whether or not you have to bake the cake ends up being a smaller issue. So we're going to look at this one first. The United States Supreme Court has ruled that a web designer, here we go, web designer does not have to serve their customers that they view go against their religion. So here's a graphic designer here, and the story's by James Gregory of BBC News. The Supreme Court has ruled in favor of a graphic designer who has refused to create wedding websites for same-sex couples. First thing I want to draw your attention to, guys, do you remember this would have been back in Obama's day when there was a wedding cake debacle with a gay couple who was upset that the bakery wouldn't bake the cake for them. So this is all coming full circle now. This is the same issue as history repeats itself. It always does. So now we're talking about online because it's COVID. So Colorado state law prohibits businesses open to the public to refuse service based on sexual orientation. That's why this case got taken up to the Supreme Court nationally. So Lori Smith is the graphic designer from Colorado, and she argued that serving same-sex couples would go against their Christian faith, much like the bakery didn't want to bake the cake for the gay wedding. Same scenario. Now, I want you to pay attention to the decision, who approves and who dissents. So first off, the landmark case pitted the rights of the LGBT people against free speech. All six conservative justices sided with the designer, and the court's 3 liberals dissented. Keep that figure in mind as we move on to our next topics, okay? 3 liberal dissenters and 6 conservatives agreeing with free speech, agreeing with the Constitution. So the majority opinion of the court is that the First Amendment, which protects free speech, blocks Colorado from forcing the designer to create endorsing messages with which she disagrees. And this boils down to, it doesn't have to be, this is the best part, and this is why it's business rights. It has nothing to do with LGBT people. This is business rights. A business should be able to choose to deny service to someone. That's their prerogative. If that ends up being a bad decision for the business, guess who that's going to hurt? That business. It happens to be about LGBT people, but this could be a First Amendment argument about anything, anybody being denied service. So Neil Gorsuch, who delivered the majority opinion, wrote that the First Amendment envisions the United States as a rich and complex place. All people are free to think and speak as they wish, not as the government demands. That's important to hear from your Supreme Court, by the way. And right now is a good time to say that I don't endorse Trump. I don't ever tell people to vote for him. I don't support him. But this is why it is important to have a conservative president. And I don't say Republican, because most Republicans are not conservative. Rhinos, you know what I mean? So it's important to have a conservative president for two reasons. Foreign policy. Ideally, conservatives are supposed to fight less wars. Ideally. And then they get to nominate Supreme Court justice members. And that is important, because this is where we sit now with a conservative Supreme Court that gets to lay out decisions like this. Can you imagine if there was 6 liberal justices and only 3 conservatives, which has happened in the past, because as people retire, they have to be filled with sitting presidents get to fill vacancies on the Supreme Court. So it is extremely important to have a conservative, not a Republican, a conservative president for this reason. And now you get down to things like affirmative action, which we're going to look at, and student loans, which we're going to look at. And try to envision if the court had been different. So, and again, and something else for us to keep in mind going forward, Sonia Sotomayor, which is one of the 3 liberal dissenting judges. So listen to these words. Today, the court, for the first time in its history, grants a business open to the public a constitutional right to refuse to serve members of a protected class. Today is a sad day in American constitutional law for LGBT people, according to Sotomayor. Just remember the rhetoric that she's using here. And keep in mind, as we open up our next one, the same exact type of rhetoric. So that was you don't have to bake the cake. That was your First Amendment rights. Now we're going to look at student loans. Joe Biden had his HEROES Act. I'm sure you guys all remember it. I can't remember the acronym off the top of my head, but I'm certain it's in the article. But the HEROES Act allowed for the federal government to provide student loan debt relief, as they called it, which in my mind is a way to negate your responsibility. And I'm somebody who's sitting with a student loan that needs to be repaid. So I would, quote unquote, benefit from having my student loan debt wiped. But I don't think I would benefit from that. It negates my responsibility. It teaches me that the daddy government will step in and save me if I'm not responsible for myself and my own actions. So load up on screen here. Make sure we all catch up to ourselves. The Supreme Court rejects Biden's plan to wipe away $400 billion in student loan debt. It's incredible. And this will be, just look at the virtue signaling that goes on for this. the Stars Canada Day sale. All right, folks, I think we're back. Just had a little bit of a technical difficulty there. We got booted out. So the Supreme Court, we're talking student loan now. The Supreme Court has canceled Biden's plan to wipe away $400 billion in student loan debts. Again, if you notice the decision here, 6-3. We've got 6 of them, and we've got 3 liberal justices, and they've effectively killed the $400 billion plan that Joe Biden had announced last year. Student debt cancellation is illegal. And you notice especially the bottom one. So a sharply divided Supreme Court effectively killed President Joe Biden's $400 billion plan to cancel or reduce federal student loan debts for millions of Americans. The 6-3 decision, again, 6-3, we've got our 6 conservative justices in the majority, said that Biden administration overstepped its authority with the plan and leaves borrowers on the hook for repayment that they are expected to resume in the fall, which is absolutely true. Can you imagine being the borrower that gave all this money away and then having the federal government wipe it all out? It's absurd. And Biden was getting ready to announce more stuff on Friday, which is fantastic. So here's the HEROES Act. This is what I was talking about. The HEROES Act is what gave Biden this power that he was wielding with this idea of eliminating $400 billion in student loan debt. See if we can find the acronym for that. Anyways, what it would have done, the forgiveness program would have canceled $10,000 in student loan debt for those making less than $125,000 or households with less than $250,000. 26 million people had applied for relief, and 43 million would have been eligible. This is pissing away your money. So, again, if you're in America, thank the fact that you had a conservative president. Whether you like Donald Trump or not, thank the fact that you had a conservative president, because as we know, the president doesn't matter for much, but it does matter for foreign policy, and it does matter for the Supreme Court. 0 politicians are heroes. I love that in the comment section here. Yeah, no, politicians are not heroes. And I'm not here to tell you the Supreme Court is your hero either. However, you should be thankful that you have a Supreme Court that is conservative stacked, conservative leaning, we'll say, rather than at the very least, rather than the opposite. Because can you imagine if, because we're about to get to affirmative action now, which is the big one. Can you imagine if we had student loan debt, we had business owner rights, and we had affirmative action on the table? Imagine this scenario with 6 liberal Supreme Court justices, with Sonia Sotomayor sitting at the head, and only 3 conservative justices to provide some sort of written verbal dissent for nobody to read. Because that's what happens with the dissent. So we'll pop this one up, and hopefully StreamYard doesn't have a stroke and we don't lose our connection again. This is going to come from CBS News, I believe it is. And yeah, and so this is the Supreme Court rejecting racism, which is how it should be. And it's important that you understand what affirmative action is, because like if you ask a liberal what affirmative action is, it's just being nice to people who were slaves. And that's basically how they describe it. And it's absurd. The actual definition is taking into account that because you are of a race, that you must have had some sort of negative experience or racism projected onto you and all this kind of stuff. And it's inherently harder for you simply because of the color of your skin. And therefore, we are going to judge you less than. Now, it's interesting because that seems to be aimed more at Black people than anything else. And as we saw from one of Joe Biden's former election staff, she cried after this announcement was made that the Supreme Court ruled against affirmative action. And she said Black people are unable to compete in a merit-based society. Let that sink in. The Biden administration is telling you that they don't believe Black people can make it on their own. They inherently need government help just to do something as mundane as get into university. We have to lower the harshness with which we grade them for their entrances into university. That's what affirmative action is. Let's see if we can get this one to pop up on screen here, and we'll have a quick look at how the cathedral media is taking this. And again, we're going to look for the decision and the numbers, because I think you guys have already figured out the pattern. The Supreme Court on Thursday has ruled that race-conscious admission policies of Harvard and University of Northern Carolina violate the Constitution. Yes, racism violates the Constitution. And it's nothing short of ironic or funny that liberals are surprised by this. I think the liberals thought that their racism was protected by the Constitution, but it is in fact not. And it is the opposite. The Constitution prevents racism. It does not allow it, if followed correctly. The court ruled, and yes, you guessed it, the court ruled 6-3 along ideological lines in the University of North Carolina case, and 6-2 in the Harvard dispute, because one of the liberal judges recused themselves. That's why it wasn't 6-3, but it would have been. Ketanji Brown Jackson recused herself. So Chief Justice Roberts authored the majority opinion, and you had Clarence, Alito, Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Barrett. These were all appointed by whom? Not all, obviously. Neil Gorsuch, Brett Kavanaugh, and Amy Coney Barrett. The last three conservative justices were appointed by a conservative president, and this is why it's important to have a conservative president. Again, it doesn't matter what you think about Trump. I'm not asking you to support him in any way, but it is important to have not Republican, conservative, because now you have 6 conservative justices facing off against 3 liberals. Now, in a fierce dissent, because remember Sonia Sotomayor, she was the dissenter, the author of the dissent in the previous 2 cases. Well, you guessed it, fierce old Sonia Sotomayor authored this one as well. And she said that the majority opinion is not grounded in law or fact and contravenes the vision of equality embodied in the 14th Amendment. Quote unquote, today this court stands in the way and rolls back decades of precedent and momentous progress. It holds that race can no longer be used in a limited way in college admissions to achieve such critical benefits. In so holding, the court cements a superficial rule of colorblindness as a constitutional principle in an endemically segregated society where race has always mattered and continues to matter. These are the words of your liberals. And again, all we need to do is put this image on screen because this is what it was. This was a week where it was the pink hats against conservative justices down in the United States. We had affirmative action, we had business rights, and we had student loan debt forgiveness on the table. And because of President Trump, just again, despite what you may or may not think of him, and despite what I actually think of him, is the reason that you're able to get these rulings. When you have 6 conservative justices, 3 of which were appointed by the former president, Donald Trump, can you imagine if Hillary Clinton had won in 2016 and there was 4 years of Hillary Clinton appointing at least 3 of her own justices? And now fast forward to 2023 and have affirmative action and student loan debt forgiveness. You could have full-fledged communism with 6 fully liberal justices. So again, I think for the most part, most Americans should be thanking the former president Donald Trump for his, if nothing else, for his appointment of 3 actual conservative justices whom have used the Constitution to prevent racism, and liberals are mad. Imagine the clown world we live in where Democrats want to be racist and they are prevented from being racist by the Constitution and the Supreme Court, and they are mad about being prevented from being racist. That is the clown world we are in right now. So that's your update on the Supreme Court. It's been a busy week. They have canceled affirmative action as of, I believe, September, October. That's no longer able to be utilized in those schools, which I believe sets the legal precedence for the rest. We'll see how that unfolds. You had them dealing with business rights. You do not have to bake the cake. If it's a gay wedding, you don't have to bake the cake. You don't have to do the graphic design for their wedding. You, as a business owner, have the right to refuse that. Supreme Court says so as of this week. And finally, student loan debt forgiveness. Joe Biden's HEROES Act, $400 billion in debt forgiveness, is canceled. So thank your Supreme Court. Thank your former president. It's been a great one, guys. It's January. I keep saying January. It is June 30th. It is Friday. Good evening. Thank you for listening. And as always, you people, you stay sovereign, okay?